A bit of sad news to report. We have experienced yet another death in wrestling. This one is Lanny Poffo, who passed away at age 68. Meltzer is reporting that he believes this is due to heart failure, although I don't believe any official cause of death has been announced yet. 68 is pretty young. Lanny Poffo, of course, was the brother of the Macho Man Randy Savage. He was the one that actually handled Macho Man's induction when he finally went into the Hall of Fame. And Lanny was an interesting fellow. I always found him to be a very strange guy, a very weird guy, especially the way he spoke. And he seemed like a very intelligent guy. He always had a lot to say, extremely opinionated, and was an interesting personality in wrestling. Now, he worked all over the place prior to his WWF days, which is where I first saw him. But prior to then, he worked in the NWA. He worked for Big Time Wrestling. He worked for his dad's ICW. He worked for Mid-South. He worked for Continental Wrestling Association alongside his brother in a lot of those territories as well. And then, of course, when Randy got the call to go up to WWE, Lanny wasn't far behind him. Now, my first memories of Lanny Poffo were of Leaping Lanny Poffo when I was a kid. Leaping Lanny Poffo was kind of like a mid-level jobber, like a Brady Boone-level jobber, where he would come out to the ring in some flashy babyface costume and his curly hair, and he would read the poetry, his poems that he would write. I believe he wrote all of his poems, and they were written on a Frisbee. And then when he was done, he would throw the Frisbee into the crowd. Now, generally, Lanny lost all of these matches. He was just an enhancement talent. That was all he was pretty much used for at the time, but he was still pretty popular, even though he never really won a lot. He might be a notch or two above Iron Mike Sharp. I think he might have even had a doll. He might have even had an action figure in the 80s. He might have. I can't remember. But other than that, he was never really more than an enhancement talent. What I remember Leaping Lanny for the most is right before WrestleMania 3. In the city that I was born in Pontiac, Michigan, they held, I can't remember if it was on Saturday Night's Main Event or what it was, but they held a battle royal just a couple of weeks ahead of WrestleMania 3, and it was the first time you actually saw Andre the Giant wearing the black thing with the strap. Hulk Hogan was also in that battle royal, so before Hogan and Andre had that big face-off at WrestleMania 3, they actually mixed it up in a battle royal. A lot of people don't know that. Andre eliminated Hulk Hogan from that battle royal. I think Hercules would go on to win it. But in that battle royal, Lanny Poffo got busted open. Andre got his hands on him and just fucked him up. I think it was hard way. He just blood all over his face and got him all busted open and just tossed Lanny right over the top rope. And I remember being scarred by that because as a kid, you really bought into what they were selling you with Andre the Giant. Even though as a kid, I myself had sat there on my own living room floor and watched Andre the Giant lose a match before, I was still convinced that he was undefeated for 15 years. They made me believe that. So to watch this guy that WWE has made me believe is invincible, even though I remember him wrestling with long hair and losing a couple of times via DQ and stuff and getting bloodied up. I remember when they cut his hair. Andre did not seem invincible to me as a kid, but they made him invincible by the time they got to WrestleMania 3. So to see him throw Lanny over the top rope with a bloody face was just something that 10-year-old Greg hadn't seen a lot of at that time. So that was always something that stuck with me. A memory of Lanny Poffo, even though it was a memory of him getting his ass kicked, is something that I've always remembered. Now, he would be repackaged a year or two later, a couple of years later, as the Genius. He would wear a cap and gown, the whole deal. And it's really ironic that Macho Man Randy Savage used the Pomp and Circumstance for his theme music when really it should have been the Genius using that, right? Isn't that always, I've always found that to be incredibly ironic. Genius didn't even have any fucking music. If he had music, it should have been his brother's music, which I always laugh at, and it's just some delicious dripping irony that wrestling is filled with. But the Genius was a genius move because now you have found a good use for Lanny Poffo. He can still come out and read his poems, but now he can read them as a heel. And he can put down the baby faces, and he's so smug, and he's got that voice and the way he prances around the ring and everything. It was perfect. He was a great wrestler / manager, and he fit that role well. He managed Mr. Perfect for a short time there before Perfect wound up with Bobby the Brain Heenan, which was a much better fit for him. But Genius also managed the Beverly Brothers, I believe, and maybe somebody else. I can't remember. And he would occasionally get in the ring. He played a role in the Hulk Hogan and Ultimate Warrior match at WrestleMania 6. There was even a match, I believe, on Saturday night's main event between the Genius and Hulk Hogan where the Genius won. I think it was right before, it was when Hogan was feuding with Perfect. It might even be the same show. I'm not totally sure. There's the Saturday night's main event where Perfect is breaking and destroying that beautiful Winged Eagle belt back there. That's my Cody point, by the way. Smashing it up with a hammer, remember? That might be the same episode where Genius scored like a count-out victory over Hogan with help, I believe, from Mr. Perfect, and he actually beat Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan lost a couple times on Saturday night's main event. Bundy beat him as well via count-out a couple of years before that. So Lanny got a victory over Hogan on Saturday night's main event. Hogan, I think, would have a rematch with him and, of course, kick his ass. But in the match that helped set up Warrior and Hogan at Mania, of course, they had the showdown in the Rumble. But then on that main event, they teamed him up against Perfect and Genius. And that's where Hogan and Warrior had the miscommunication that would finally implode and lead to them facing at WrestleMania 6. So the Genius had a hand in that as well. I'm trying to think who else he managed, but he kind of disappeared in around 1993 in WWE. He did come back in 94 to wrestle a couple of matches, but he was gone before he even really re-debuted on TV. And then, of course, he had that famous WCW contract where they kept him under contract for a couple of years as a favor to Randy Savage, and he never worked for them. I think he showed up and did one TV, and they had plans for him to dye his hair and have this whole gimmick, and something never panned out, and he was basically just paid for a couple of years, probably on Slim Jim's dime. I can't remember what Eric Bischoff claims the deal with that was, but I think part of the deal of bringing Randy in was to hire his brother, but I know Slim Jim picked up a lot of Randy's contract as well, so WCW might not have felt any of that cost, but it's always been, something that's been joked about in wrestling that Lanny, basically got a 2-year contract for doing nothing, or however long it was that he was under contract to WCW and never worked for them. It would have probably been interesting had they brought him in and debuted him on TV. It wouldn't have been odd because they were bringing everybody from WWE from the 80s out on TV. Honky Tonk Man and Boss Man and Earthquake and anybody they could get. Paul Orndorff, we're all making the jump to WCW who were in WWE before. So I'm surprised they didn't have the Genius come out as the Graduate or just change his name. He can still wear a cap and gown, just call him the Graduate. He can use the music and everything, but we never saw Lanny Poffo in WCW ever. He would work some independent stuff. He would stay active in the independent circuit all the way until his later years. He even had that weird... Have you seen that shoot thing that he did with Hannibal all those years ago? I mean, it was obviously a work, but it was a work shoot where he barged into the locker room after some show, probably in Canada, barged into the locker room and starts motherfucking Hannibal and slapping him in the face and everything, and they kind of get into it. And Hannibal takes him down, actually. Really weird, but not sure what that angle was all about, but he did that. And, of course, Lanny had a lot of things to say about Randy Savage and his Hall of Fame induction, and Lanny was big in the Randy documentaries, I believe, the A&E one, I think even the one WWE did on Randy, where he spoke a lot about Randy and his life and things like that. So I thought, in Randy's death, Lanny Poffo, as weird as he was, I always thought did a good job of honoring his brother and making sure, the fans knew what an important and a big deal he was. That was important to Lanny Poffo, to make sure that the fans knew and appreciated Randy Savage. He didn't have to worry about that with me. Randy was my second favorite wrestler of all time behind Bret the Hitman Hart. So it was a sad death, he learning of Lanny Poffo's passing. Hacksaw Jim Duggan, by the way, was the one that delivered the news. Our buddy Devlin, who is currently on the Jericho Cruise right now, just had dinner with Hacksaw a couple of days ago. I think the night before Hacksaw announced the news. So I'm curious if Hacksaw knew when he was hanging out with him if he had passed away and why Hacksaw was the one chosen to deliver this news. But very unfortunate. Condolences to the remaining members of the Poffo family, everybody who knew Lanny, and of course, with his ties to Randy Savage and all of my memories of Lanny as a heel and a babyface in WWE, this was definitely a death I wanted to speak about because I have a lot of memories of Lanny, good and bad, and rest in peace to Lanny Poffo.